Chapter 6. Holy moly was the first thought that popped into young Tobias's mind as he spied the little man walking through the hallway of the fine hotel. Tobias had seen more than you might expect considering his young age, but he had not seen something like this before. He had already seen a historical day in the unseasonal snowfall that happened this afternoon. It was only mid-June, and yet it had snowed in the city for several hours. And now, if he wasn't mistaken, he had to be one of the first to see an actual fairy in the city. He was only 10, but was no longer in school, because since his father had gone to the Great War and not returned, it had been up to him to help his mum support the family. He had 5 younger siblings, and his mum worked 2 jobs, but still needed help. So Tobias had taken on the role of breadwinner to help the family. Tobias was a bootblack of uncommon skill. It was something that his father had shown him at a younger age, and he had taken a shine to. He was very detail-oriented and patient, and would take the time necessary to ensure that any footwear he was given would be returned with a mirror's sheen. Tobias also added just a touch of bacon grease to his soaps that gave an added shine and had the advantage of giving the shoes a slight, pleasant aroma. Tobias saw a lot because he traveled about the city shining boots and shoes and occasionally other leather goods like saddles and whatnot. He had more than a few regular customers because many people told him that he was a wizard with a rag and polish. Despite his young age, Tobias was able to significantly help the family out with his earnings so that they did not end up in the poorhouse. He and his family ate well and regularly, and this was due in no small part to Tobias's skill with a rag. People also liked to talk while he worked on their footwear, especially, as was often the case, if they were wearing said shoes while Tobias plied his craft. Maybe because he was young, or maybe because people perceived a common bootblack as unimportant, Tobias was often told things that his customer would not have told another living soul. Some of these things included a variety of dalliances, some petty crime, and even something bordering on sedition. Tobias thought that perhaps one of the reasons people requested his services over and over was not just because of his skill with rag and polish, but because of the almost confessional nature of some of his interactions with his customers. So while he had seen some things you would not expect a 10-year-old boy to have witnessed, he was pretty sure that not many in the city had laid eyes upon an actual fairy. He could tell that the diminutive figure was not just a small man. Tobias recalled a photograph in his granddad's row house and a story his granddad used to tell about meeting Little Man, General Tom Thumb, when the famous Little Man was touring the countryside. Tobias himself had seen a little person when the fair had toured the city last fall, and the small figure flitting through the hallway, though a little smaller than the others with which he had limited experience, was definitely something different. It wasn't just the way the figure was dressed, almost like a costume doll from a century or two gone by. It was partly the fact that the little man made no sound when he moved, and partly it was the way Tobias felt when looking on the small figure. Tobias instinctively wanted to follow the small figure, but it also looked like he was going in the same direction that Tobias needed to go anyway. The little man was heading in the direction of Mr. Penrose's office. Tobias was here at the hotel to visit that same office. He had been there earlier in the day, turning Mr. Penrose's shoes into twin mirrors, and was the one who had told the Enterprise boss about the snowfall, because Penrose had been engrossed in the daily paper. When Tobias had said, "Mr. Penrose, sir, it's snowing," the older gentleman hadn't even looked up from his paper. He had simply said, "Don't be silly, lad. It's only mid-June." Well, that much was true, but it was still snowing, and as such, had to be a historic day of sorts for the city. The plush office of the head of the Enterprise that ran the west side of the city was several floors up, and there were a fancy lift, complete with a uniformed lift attendant. The little queerly dressed gentleman was steering clear of the lift. Instead, he was heading toward the stairway. He wasn't sure how he knew, but Tobias had the feeling that the little man didn't quite trust the lift, or at the very least, he didn't like it. Tobias hung back and followed the little fellow as quietly as he was able. They went up several flights of stairs and didn't encounter any other guests or employees of the hotel. This was not strange because it was a little later in the evening, and this part of the city was quiet and respectable. And speaking of respectable, Tobias himself was dressed as fancy as he could be, in his church clothes, in fact. This because he actually had a business question to ask of Mr. Penrose. That question was the reason young Tobias had intentionally left a brush and tin of polish next to the settee where earlier this afternoon he had polished the dark, worn loafers of Mr. Penrose. This way, he had a reason to return. Tobias held back for about 15 seconds after the little fellow reached the floor where the Enterprise office was, and then made his way toward the heavy, ornate door that was almost always open. Truth be told, that door gave him the willies. It was heavy, dark, and ornately carved. Tobias heard from one of the lift attendants, who was a little boy back when the brick was a secret weapon, that no one in the hotel knew where the door had come from. It was just always there. As Tobias got nearer to the door, which was mere moments after the little man had stepped into the room, he noticed a bloody handprint on the door. That did not help with the whole creepiness of the portal. The young bootblack was almost at the door and heard the little man speak for the first time. In fact, it was the only noise the fairy had made since Tobias first spotted him on the ground floor. Tobias did not catch what the small figure said, but did hear a soft, high voice coming from it. What young Tobias did clearly hear right after was a familiar voice. It was Mr. Penrose saying, "What the hell?" This surprised the bootblack because everyone knew that the head of the Enterprise did not care for vulgar language, so everyone refrained from using it in front of him. At least the smart ones did. Tobias poked his head into the room and was surprised to see everyone standing near the middle of the room and looking towards the doorway. The boy was even a little more taken aback that the small fellow had been pointing right at where Tobias ended up in the doorway. How did he even know Tobias had been following him? "This young fellow wants to have a word with you, Penrose," the little fellow said, out loud in a high, soft voice. As he spoke, the small figure winked slyly at Tobias. The little gesture made Tobias feel like you would imagine a puppy feels when his master comes home from the end of a long day at work. If Tobias possessed a tail, it would have been wagging. "That's all right, Mr. Penrose, sir," Tobias spoke. "I can come back, 'cause it looks like you're busy." Penrose looked about to speak when Pecht spoke up. "Nonsense, lad," the pixie continued. "With you tell old Penrose what brings you here." The small figure winked at him again and said, "You sneaking about after me we can keep to ourselves." Although the pixie said that part out loud, so Tobias wasn't sure how that was a secret, since all the other people in the office could not help but to hear it. Tobias looked to the Enterprise leader and then over to the two large men on the far side of the room. When he looked on them, he was taken aback because both large men had a lot of blood on their clothes. It was Teague and Gerald, cleaning themselves with towels and water from a basin that now held a lot of pink water. Gerald's clothing looked like he had been dunked in blood. Tobias actually shivered. "Don't worry, lad," Penrose told the boy. "Teague and Gerald are okay, though I do believe the reason Gerald is with us at all is because of Master Pecht." The pixie gave a sly smile and said, "Pecht will do, old boy." Penrose cocked his head and asked the pixie, "Is Pecht your given name or your surname?" Teague knew that Penrose had a penchant for addressing people by their given name, so was not surprised by his employer's inquiry. Pecht's response was simply, "Yes." Penrose's face darkened briefly, and then he said, "As you will, Pecht." Penrose pointed over to the settee where Tobias had left his equipment earlier in the day and asked, "Is that why you left your gear here this afternoon? So you'd have a reason to come back and speak to me?" Tobias replied, "Yes, sir, Mr. Penrose. I have a business question." "Indeed," Penrose said. "But that's before I saw the fairy, Pecht," Tobias said. Pecht looked a little distressed at being referred to that way, and everyone was a little surprised when Gerald blurted out, "He's no fairy, Tobias. He's a pixie. And those two folk don't get along." Tobias noticed Teague slowly nodding his head as Gerald spoke, and Gerald continued with, "It's like the Chinese and Japanese." Pecht's eyebrows rose at this, and he spoke in his high, soft voice. "You know, Gerald, it is kind of like that." Sorry, Mr. Pecht, the boy offered, but the pixie waved him off. No harm, lad, Pecht said. Tell old Penrose what you came here for. Penrose nodded his head in the sand and said, Go ahead, Tobias. What brings you here besides your brush and polish? Well, Mr. Penrose, sir, Tobias started, I wanted to talk to you about a property you have on 3rd Avenue and the little side building on that property. Yes, Penrose said, I know the property and the side building. Well, sir, the young bootblack said, I was hoping to use it for a shine stand and hoping that it would be okay with you. Penrose's brow furrowed momentarily, then he spoke. Well, young Tobias, I am not in the habit of having business dealings with children. Tobias looked a bit crestfallen, but Penrose continued. I know about your situation and about your father not coming home. We lost too many good men to that dreadful war. Tobias noticed that Teague, in particular, lowered his head when Penrose mentioned the Great War. Penrose spoke again. I know that you've taken the role of man of the house for your family, so I will treat you as such. Tobias's expression brightened at this, and the boy said, I was thinking that maybe I could pay you a percentage of my earnings, Mr. Penrose, sir. Penrose nodded his head in the negative and said, That won't do, young Tobias. The enterprise head continued, You can use the side building for your own purposes, and the only thing I will accept is that you will take care of my footwear in perpetuity. Gerald looked confused at this statement. The bruiser often got a similar look on his ruddy face. Tobias spoke up. Purple who? Pecht spoke up in his soft-hide voice. He means forever, lad. Oh, the boy said, I think that sounds keen, Mr. Penrose, sir. The boy smiled and shook hands with the enterprise leader. The pixie spoke up. See there, lad? That wasn't so hard. Well, thank you, Mr. Pecht, Tobias said. I guess I'd best be getting home. It was a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Pecht, the boy said as he started to go. Pecht smiled at the boy and said, The pleasure was mine, lad. The pixie spoke as the boy was starting to leave. Maybe you and your lads can help with a fairy problem I'm having. Everyone in the room looked surprised. Here they had met a real live pixie who was now talking about another being literally out of a fairy tale. Penrose spoke up. Well, what kind of problem is that? And Pecht said, I really don't care for fairies. I would dare say that maybe I hate them, except now I'm in love with one. Penrose and Tobias both blurted out, What the hell?